So I've said this on a couple of videos before, but I don't really have a favourite director as such. There's no one director where I like all of their stuff. But there are a few directors where I try to follow their work, in particular kind of lower budget B-movie directors. That's what this channel kind of is more about. You may have heard the name Rene Perez a few times. I've kind of quite enjoyed his stuff, even though I objectively know a lot of his movies aren't very good. Another kind of name you may have heard me say is Perry Reginald Teo. Now, he recently kind of passed away, sadly, so I've been trying to kind of catch up on films of his that I've yet to see. One of these films is the 2011 movie called Dead Inside, also known as The Evil Inside. And this is a movie I hadn't seen before this review. So, how to describe Dead Inside? Well, I guess you would say the elevator pitch, I suppose, would be something along the lines of Final Destination meets Carrie. At least that's the broad strokes of it. So let me give you a brief plot synopsis here. It focuses on this kind of teenager called Sarah, who has some type of nondescript mental disadvantages, let's just call it. She seems to have somewhat disturbed, to put it bluntly. And, you know, she's led a sheltered life, and her parents just need a break. So they want to go away for a short time, so they invite this other girl round who Sarah was once kind of friendly with. But they're not really close, it's just that there's very limited options at this point. So this kind of other girl kind of turns up, but she takes it upon herself to invite a bunch of friends for a house party. And things soon take a dark turn because Sarah, who is this, as I say, this girl with severe kind of issues, she seems to be able to have premonitions about people's deaths. And she starts telling people this, and inevitably the first body turns up. And then people start kind of freaking out about the kind of predictions that Sarah has said. Inevitably, it starts to become somewhat of a self-fulfilling prophecy. But there may well be other kind of supernatural elements, or maybe even kind of more terrestrial things at work here. What will happen? You'll have to watch the movie and find out. So let's discuss what works in this movie's favour. Now, I think this movie is kind of posing somewhat of a question, like it's almost had Sarah not mentioned anything, would this stuff have even happened? Or is it the fact that these people were kind of believing that obviously they were in danger ultimately led to them to kind of act out these things and kind of, as I say, be somewhat of a self-fulfilling prophecy? I mean, that I think is the central question that this movie poses. So it's trying to be somewhat kind of philosophical, I suppose, in some way at least. So it's a somewhat of an interesting kind of idea, I think. The execution of which we'll talk about in a short time, but it's an interesting kind of idea. Now, one of the reasons why I like Perry Reginald Teo as a director is I think he comes across as kind of like a B-movie equivalent of James Wan, who of course was responsible for like the Insidious movies, the Conjuring movies. He has a kind of similar visual style with a lot of his movies to, like I say, a low-budget kind of James Wan. And although I would say that's true of a lot of his films, it's less so in this one. But nonetheless, there is still a kind of old dark house vibe to it. The movie is almost entirely shot over kind of one evening in the film, at least. So it's kind of a always like a dark house, which adds to the kind of the atmosphere here. It's clearly kind of filmed at a kind of it's a low budget movie. And as such, I think the kind of the darkness helps to kind of try and hide some of the kind of the budget limitations. There's one or two kind of VFX shots that are somewhat obscured, or they kind of, you don't see much of them, but at the same time, I do think that kind of goes towards some of the mystery involved in this movie. And this movie does have a somewhat of a mystery, so if you like, a kind of like what's kind of going on kind of style movie, then you may be interested in this. I think the movie takes a big swing in regard to somewhat of a twist towards kind of the end of the movie. I don't know how people will feel about that twist, because it's one of those kind of like, no, they didn't, but they did. But, you know, it's a swing. It's kind of like certainly a choice, and, you know, it's all about risks, I suppose, and, you know, whether people appreciate them or not is another story, but at least we've got filmmakers willing to take these risks now and then. And, you know, to be fair to the film, I think the movie is, even though I say there's elements of carriers, elements of kind of like Final Destination, that's inevitable death and all that, you know, it still has a somewhat of a kind of original idea to a certain degree. But let's talk about what doesn't work, first of all. Now, let me just start with some kind of technical elements here. Now, as I mentioned, the movie takes place all over one kind of night. Now, the problem with that is, as much as it might look spooky and dark, is that the movie is permanently low light. So it sometimes is difficult to see what is kind of going on. And it makes for a relatively dreary watch because it's ultimately all kind of like in shadow. Now, spooky and kind of atmospheric, maybe the downside of that is it's, you know, like I said, it's not exactly spectacular on screen here, and, you know, you'll struggle to kind of see what is going on, but that's not the only thing you'll struggle with. The other thing you'll struggle with, I think, is probably the actual quality of the audio here. Now, I'd say this is down to two factors. Number one, some of the actors, and in particular our main actress who plays the role of Sarah, this kind of this girl who has these kind of mental issues, tends to mumble and whisper. A lot of the kind of like the dialogue is kind of in sort of low volume whispers, kind of murmurs and things like that. The actress tends to kind of mumble, and it's really difficult to understand the dialogue sequences. She's not the only one that does it. There's a couple of instances where I'd say the other actors do this as well. So it's not particularly kind of strong projected dialogue. Now, the other issue that kind of compounds this is I think the audio mixing in general isn't particularly strong. So we have a kind of a movie which takes place in kind of, you know, dingy kind of like cinematography, not great audio, not a good start, and we haven't even talked about the plot, but we will now. Let's talk about the plot. A little bit incomprehensible, I would say. And you're not going to believe the twist. I mean, they're thinking they didn't do that, did they? They did. It's like one of these things where you're thinking, oh my god, I can't believe a film would do that. But the plot is kind of like, I think it thinks it's clever. As I say, I think the whole idea of this one is it a self-fulfilling prophecy? But it really is just like, there's so many kind of leaps in logic, like these kind of group of partygoers that turn up at this house are somehow locked in the house, even after the first death. I don't think about smashing a window in or anything like that. No one can conveniently get a cell reception or anything like that. And it's just like an excuse to keep them in this house, and people's kind of like logical reactions to things and kind of their responses to certain things that happen in the movie are just kind of like eye-rollingly, like just not realistic depictions of how the majority of humans would probably act. I mean, you might get one person acting like a complete spanner, but I doubt you'll get a whole house people of doing it. It just doesn't make sense. So the actual plot here is like really confused about what's going on. Is this something supernatural? Is it something psychological? Is it kind of like some type of just paranormal force? Is it a killer? Is it a ghost? We just, you know, it's really unclear. And then we get to the kind of the end and thinking, ah, my God. And the kind of the reveal here is like, well, let me just say, I think the majority of people will find it eye-rollingly unsatisfactory. VFX-wise, there's a couple of, I say, attempts here to have these kind of somewhat subdued VFX, somewhat obscured, maybe for budgetary reasons, or maybe it was just a stylistic choice, I'm not sure. It's lacking that kind of, that James Wan aesthetic that I think Perry Reginald Teo sometimes has, outside of it being an old dark house. There's not a huge amount of VFX on display here. A lot of it is just kind of shadowy figures in the background and stuff like that. So we don't really get anything particularly kind of overt, considering this movie is predicated against the kind of the idea of, you know, incoming death, and it's kind of unavoidable. You would expect maybe to have some interesting death scenes. No, it's more or less you'll see after the fact, or very much just kind of like close kind of, you know, close up, so you can't really see what's going on, or choppy editing and things like that. So you'll never really get a particularly kind of like anything particularly graphic on screen. It's more or less that's kind of the idea here that's kind of posed. The acting is mixed, to say the least. As I've said, I already mentioned, I think some of the kind of the performances here are just too subdued. They kind of needed to be a bit more kind of dramatic and at least audible. I would take audible at the very, very least. But the characters are weak in kind of like stereotypes. You know, we've got the cocky jockey kind of guy. You know, all that sort of thing. Because they're somewhat kind of nice guy, etc. So it's kind of very, even though I think the movie thinks it's being relatively clever with maybe the synopsis of the plot, the elements that surround it I feel are weak. I have to be honest with you, this is it's quite a weak film. There's not much here, you know, we're talking story-wise, acting-wise, VFX-wise, on technical difficulties. I mean, normally I can be fairly kind of like, I can find some things to kind of say, well, that was a good job. Here, many aspects of the movie I think are lacking. So, you know, this one I've got to give it a 2 out of 10. It's a pretty poor film overall. Only I think this central spark of an idea maybe could have been the germ of a good film, but the execution in this one is quite poor. So sadly, not a great movie in any sense of the word. So 2 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Please do leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.